It's just an artifact of Zoom life. I was logged into the application personal account, which doesn't have YouTube permissions. Okay. So, but now that I know that happened, we're good to go and we're on YouTube, everybody. So feel free to.
Thank you, Keith. So we're all set. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Appreciate it. And thank you, Nene. We'll call the meeting to order. And Nene, can you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mary Kate Mirren.
Present.
Max Starks.
Present.
Vicky Krause.
Present.
Eric Hagopian. Maurice Lindsay.
Present.
Jeff Sattler.
Present.
And Janae McDonald.
Present.
Thank you.
Great. Good evening, everyone. So why don't we jump right into our fiscal year 2021 budget review and update.
Good evening, everyone. So we currently have just under $9.9 million at TD Bank. We just had our first spring financial aid disbursement, which brought in about $4.8 million in financial aid money. Based on an overall reduction in spring summer enrollment of 22%, we are projecting to end the year at a balance of just over $1.6 million. Are there any questions on the cash flow?
None for me. Looks consistent with what we talked about last month. Yeah, no questions for me.
I just have a question. Obviously, it's a pretty large dollar amount, which is awesome. Gets us through the year. Is there a breakdown of where those funds came from outside of what you had just stated?
If you, Keith, can you just go forward a few slides? So the breakdown is up on the top, actually the bottom section, the projected cash sources. So you can see where Pell, SCOG funds, direct loans, the detail is shown below for where the incoming funds are.
Yep.
Any other questions? Okay, Keith, if you go forward, we'll go on to Jason with the revenue and spending.
Will you go to the next slide, please? I just wanted to hit on a few highlights that we have as far as revenue and spending goes. As of right now, we're currently projecting a $2 million surplus for FY21. This projection is still a work in progress, and as the year end approaches, it'll likely change as we refine our projections. Despite the decrease in revenue due to the enrollment decline, we've successfully managed expenses this year. The bulk of the expense savings comes from lower adjunct salary expenses, less part-time staffing, and lower operating costs due to the limited activity on campus. We're currently being strategic about what we're going to do with that surplus, and we're assessing the needs of the academic departments to determine if we can fund any of their requests this year. Can we move to the next slide, please? All right, and then this is just a snapshot of where we're at currently. Do we have any additional questions about the revenue and spending?
Yeah, question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
My question was just going to be, I assume that surplus is really due to the non-recurring funds that came in that were COVID related and not just purely operations.
It's kind of it's two. So the CARES funding paid for a lot of additional expenses that we wouldn't have normally incurred. Where we are seeing a lot of the savings now, for example, is not being on campus. We're seeing savings in some of our utilities bills. There's operating savings from not being on campus. For example, less students on campus means less bus passes. So there are, in addition, a big piece of it with less students, we have less adjuncts working because there's less classes being taught. So in addition to the CARES funding that has supplemented a lot of our additional expenses, we have had actual cost savings as well.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So were you going to walk through this schedule, or you wanted to just ask if we had questions on this?
I
I
mean,
questions.
I hit on the highlights as
Okay.
far as, you know, the main items. If you wanted to go
Got it.
through it in a little bit more detail, we could, or I could just answer questions.
Yeah,
it's
there's
up
a
to
couple
you.
line items. I had a question on. Line item
Sure.
7,
Okay.
tuition remission to the state.
Yes.
What is that?
So we have to, for all of our day classes, we need to, there's a formula for it, but we need to remit tuition to the state. So all of our tuition, the $25 a credit for in-state students, we need to actually send that down to the state.
Okay, for some reason, I don't remember seeing that in the past, but that's okay. Thank you for that explanation. And then line up number 8, commissions, administrative overhead. What is that?
All right, bear with me 1 second.
$1.2 million approved for the budget, and we're expecting 900,000.
So basically what that is, and it's a little tricky because the cell is wrapped. It's the trust fund revenues, which is mostly workforce development. So that's kind of other additional revenues that fall outside of student fees. You'd also have vending commissions from the bookstore, you know, all of those miscellaneous types of revenues.
Okay, a lot of stuff included in that, you know, and okay, it makes sense then why it's down 260,000. Next question was down on contingency, you know, so line item 29, a $2.1 million approved budget. We expect to spend 2.9 million, $800,000 increase. What is driving that?
Yeah, we had a lot of our additional funding that was in, you know, the COVID relief funding that was lumped into that bucket. So we had a good portion of our gear funding as well as the institutional bucket of CARES money, which was lumped into that contingency. Contingency is a lot higher than it's historically been right now, and that's due to those higher education relief funds that we've received.
Okay, so it's included in there. Gotcha.
Yes.
And then I'm not quite sure if I want to ask the next question on facilities projects here or on the next slide, but we've got no year-to-date spend at all, but we're expecting to spend 3.2 million for the year, and it was all project stuff. So I'm curious what's going on with that, especially since we're asking for another 100,000. Not asking for it, but we're saying we're going to spend another 100,000 over what we typically budget for this area.
I can address that. And Deb's going to be presenting a little bit later on in this presentation. They give you a little bit more well-rounded view of what's happening with facilities. But as far as the presentation purposes, we haven't hit that threshold of the roll forward amount yet. So that's why we haven't put any dollar amounts on here, but you'll be able to see in the next slide a little bit more information about what our spending has been.
Yeah, we have on this schedule, in our February year-to-date actual, we got literally have 0.
Yes. Yeah, and that's because, and that's we can talk about that offline as well as far as presentation purposes goes. The next slide is the backup that shows you where our current spending is. And historically, we haven't showed any dollar amount in this portion of the report until we hit that roll forward threshold. So we had about $2 million roll forward from last year. So until we hit that roll forward amount, we wouldn't actually populate anything here. But we can talk about that if that's something you want to change.
Yeah, okay, let's do that.
Let's
do that.
Okay. Any other questions on this report?
Yes, I have a question on line item 18, the retirement payouts, et cetera.
Yes.
It seems like that's pretty much, if I can recall historically, about that number. But have you seen more employees want to take early retirement, or, you know, a part of that number? How much is the retirement payout versus the overtime status and whatnot?
I don't have that breakdown off the top of my head, but one thing that we did have this year was When we did eliminated those additional programs, a lot of those folks did qualify for early retirement or for retirement. So we did see some payouts there. In that line item is also payroll tax, overtime, as well as state chargebacks, which are expenses that we pay to the state for our using their HR module, you know, with them as far as unemployment benefits and things of that nature. So there really are a lot of items sitting in that one line.
Yeah, I'd like to see a breakdown of that, just
Sure.
from the standpoint of how many people on average retire. What's that bucket? Is that 1 million of the 2.1, or is that higher or lower? And what do we expect for the following year?
Okay. Yep,
Jeff,
I do
I'll try-
have a breakdown, just not right in front of me.
Yeah,
I can try to peg it too for trustees. I would say on average for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been seeing somewhere between 12 and 15 retirements. I mean, again, this is sort of classic baby boomer sort of behavior. What was different, as Jason mentioned, is we offered a early retirement incentive, $10,000 beyond any other incentives the state may have put on the table there. That didn't really budge things, you know, even opening the door to people who had lost their jobs. I think maybe had about 6 people who ultimately stepped forward. So that incentive did not necessarily help. And again, I would say on average, we probably will see slightly less retirements this year, at least right now. But again, faculty have all the way up until, if you will, the summer to declare their retirement. So we're in a window where maybe things will change a little bit in the next 3 or 4 months.
yeah. I think there might be an impact on the budget. That's why I was just curious, because it seems like that was a number that's been consistent year over year. Thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, moving on to facilities project report.
Great. Next slide, please. All right, so this gives you a little bit a better idea of where we're at with our current spending. So you can see if you look all the way down to line 32, that we've spent about $800,000 yet so far this year. We're projecting to spend a little over 3 million. So that's where we're at. And this shows you the breakdown of what those projects are that we've been spending.
Yeah, let's talk offline about just the presentation, you know, on the other schedule. It's almost like we're not spending anything and we actually are. So let's just connect on that.
Sounds good.
And is
All
it
right.
likely that we can spend those additional funds in the next 3.5 months?
I'll let Deb touch on that in her presentation. I know that we've done a lot of studies and some of these studies take a long time, and now we're getting a lot of studies back, which means we can move forward on the actual projects. So that's one of the pieces that comes into play, but she'll be able to give you a little bit more information.
Yeah, I can just add one thing.
Sure.
Right now. A lot of the projects happen over the summer. So a good portion of the money is spent at the end of the year.
Well, it would be helpful to see, like, just look at the line 20, the radio station. I know that's a pretty sizable number. It'd be nice to have what the budget is for each one of these, by not seeing what we're going to be spending versus what has been spent. It doesn't tell us a lot as far as where we are with all of these projects. I mean, I believe some of them have rolled from 2019 or 2020 into the 21 budget, right?
Yeah, Jeff, and I think that we used to see that in the past on this exhibit. Yeah.
In a different report, but we would see the full,
Right.
you know, the full cost, you know.
Right.
I thought it was like 450,000 to move that radio station, et cetera. And if we only spent 18, where are we in that budget? Have we spent 70% of it so far and it's almost completed, or percentage of completion with all of these projects? It would be helpful to get a better idea. And like Vicki mentioned, maybe you can push some of the final expenditures into the 22 budget. You don't know.
I took note of that. We'll work on getting that in next month's presentation.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Any other comments, questions?
Great. Next slide, please. This just gives an idea of what we're using our DCAM funding and how much we've gotten from DCAM. So they give us an allocation as far as money that we can spend on capital projects. So the only thing that's a little different on this month's report is that we broke out the 5-year DCAM funding that they gave us, that $12.1 million from the other funding, just to kind of see how that breaks down. This year, they gave us $525,000 to offset some of our small projects that we have on campus. So that was a bonus this year that, you know, we don't necessarily count on the future, but would be nice. So, and then it shows where we're at with our spending on these of $246,000.
And why didn't we include an estimate for 2022 and 2023 for our expense?
I put that in there just because this is this is a 5-year capital funding from DCAM. So I wanted to show how it's going to all project out for that $12,100,000 that they gave us as part of this funding.
No, I get that. I was just curious about our end. So expenses, right? So right now we got nothing for what we would expect to spend in those 2 periods. I'm just curious why we have.
We expect to spend the entire budget amount. So I can add that as a projection as well.
Yeah, the fact that it was 0, I was just curious why we would have done that, but there's no rhyme or reason behind it because we would expect to spend all of it. But just wanted to make sure that I was understanding why those were zeros.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's because we anticipate spending those full dollar amounts in those years to use that full 12.1 million by the end of 2023.
Yep. And then even the way it would line up. So right now you've got the estimate of 4.183 in 2022, and it'd be nice to see, well, what would we expect to spend if we had our druthers.
And Deb's got a little bit more detail on that on her slides
okay,
when she presents.
Okay.
And these dollar amounts are all then the projects that have gone through studies and reviews that have been approved by DCAM.
Deb, do you want to touch on that?
Not all of them, and I'll show you in the one of my slides how many we've done and how many are still remaining.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? Okay, hearing none. Thank you. Moving on to prepping fiscal year 2022 budget.
So good evening, everybody. I'm going to offer just some framing comments, and then I'll turn it over to Andrea and Deborah to kind of walk through. Right off the top, I just want everyone to know you've got the sort of first draft in there, and my great thanks to our team, particularly Andrea, Dorothy, and Jason. A ton of work trustees have already gone into really massaging and working through what is crafted for your first look, your first consideration. And, you know, people are sort of wearing 3 hats right now. They're sort of toggling back from the rollover from last year. We're living this year. We're now looking ahead. So we're kind of wearing 3 different lenses right now with all this work. Further, what you're going to find is we really don't have a model to forecast enrollment for next year. That's going to continue to be a really big question mark for us. We also don't yet know the specific dollar amounts from the American Rescue Plan, but we do expect that to be sizable, and it certainly would be helpful if it is fairly unrestricted so we can tie it to some of our capital costs. We'll clearly be talking more with you in the next 2 months about that. What you're going to also see is within this budget is the ability to really relaunch the college and reposition us, particularly with technology and our capital needs. As much as we talk a lot about capital, and there's a key focus tonight, you know, I'm thinking about something that would otherwise fly under the radar, which is a need to overhaul our wireless on campus. As we prepare to come back on campus, there's going to be that much more demand for that wireless network. And the project is about $400,000 to $500,000 to really overhaul that. That's very much needed. It's certainly costly, and it's projects like that that will really help stand us in good stead going forward. Again, Andrew's going to review some of the assumptions. What is not included is the assumption yet about fall on campus. Higher education, our students and our employees, unless they're in certain risk categories, are not yet included in the vaccination phase. We also right now are operating under indoor social distancing guidelines, regulations that require 6 feet of social distancing. Those absolutely bear on how much we can get back on campus come this fall. So it may be when we're putting the final pieces together in the budget, let's say in June, that we have a better look at what fall looks like. And that obviously has bearing on our budget. You'll see we're coming back around with trustees to talk about your outlook on automotive needs, particularly building 25 and also cosmetology and the relocation. So we're going to bring that back up for conversation with you. Again, spotlighting Deb Avery, our Senior Director of Facilities. She's going to really give a great dive into the way that we sort of chase your appropriations, if you will. The fact that we can never quite get the spending that you appropriate every year, and yet that enabling allows us to move these things forward. Those certified studies really are a bear sometimes to sort of bear with how long it takes to make those happen. And obviously the price tag, they really do eat into some of these project costs. And then even just, I think Deb's going to put a fine point on this idea of sort of rolling forward what we've been doing last year and then looking ahead. Obviously a really important conversation. And next month, we'll have Mary Kozlowskis, our CIO, do the same look with all of you about IT projects that we have in the works and projected up. So that's, again, just a little bit of framing as we dive into it, but I'll turn it over to Amy.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So just a couple of comments to start. As Dr. Cook said, this is our first draft of the budget, the draft one of probably 3, and so starting out, this is essentially a baseline, kind of a conservative first look. And so this isn't the best we're going to do. We haven't yet scrubbed the detail for opportunities. This is really, continuing operations as they are. What would the budget look like next year? So just so everyone's on the same page about what this is. Also, you might have noticed if you looked at the packet that we're sharing 2 versions. One is what we're calling our baseline budget. What would happen if we had no COVID relief funding? And then, but ultimately we do have this COVID relief funding, and that's going to help us balance our budget. So, but I wanted everyone to see what it would look like if we didn't have that funding. Given the fact that we do have the funding, I'm confident that we'll be able to balance this budget without any painful decisions, any difficult conversations. I think that, that funding is really critical for us, but I just want us to keep in mind, what it would look like without that. So anyway, those are just kind of introductory, sort of getting us all on the same page kind of comments. If we go to the next slide, please. So I just want to start with major assumptions. So on the revenue side, we're assuming that our state appropriation is flat. We're, for now in this version, assuming that enrollment will be down 5% from this year. And we're also, traditionally, there's a student fee increase in the budget. This year, we are planning not to increase student fees. We can talk about that, but right now there's no student fee increase in the budgeted revenue. On the expense side.
Andrea?
Yep.
So I know this is the first cut, but I'm curious to thinking of the 5% enrollment down from 2021, which we know was severely impacted, obviously, by COVID and, with vaccines and the like, so just curious what the thinking is, at least at this stage in the draft, for enrollment relative to, should it be 2021 base? Should it be 2020 base, or 2019 base? Just kind of curious what the thinking is here.
Yeah, first of all, really good question. I think we're really looking for those answers. It's a little early to say. Actually, since we published this, we've done a little, we've done some analysis. Institutional research folks have done some analysis and actually think it might be worse than the 5%, but we're going to be looking into that over the next few weeks. So, it might be premature to kind of speculate at this point, but it sounds like the folks like coming out of the high schools, like for new students coming out of high school, there are going to be some challenges potentially getting them to enroll. So I think that we will have a lot more information on that at the next meeting. But at this point, this is sort of a best guess right now.
Okay, you just assume 5% down right now, but without, right. Okay, I'm with you, okay.
So it's really more letting you know, it's 5% down in the budget now, but we really need to do a lot more work and analyzing the future enrollment. But it's
Okay.
going to be, that's going to be
Understood.
tricky. It's really one of the most critical assumptions, and it's going to be very, very difficult to.
Well, that's why I ask what the thinking was that went into the assumption, right? I mean, it's going to be it's going to be a thumbs in the air. I get it, but backed by assumption makes sense. So I was curious what the thinking was, at least at this point. I know it's the first round, but there's a lot of moving parts now, more so than what we were thinking even 3 months ago. So
Right.
so as you start building,
I just say, right, for trustees, it's the compounding effect. What we see from last fall was down 16%. This spring, we're down 22%. And a lot of that is because we can't get what our students and faculty desire, which is to be in person on campus. That's really the fundamental here. If that holds for fall, depending on vaccination and social distancing, if we can't scale back up for fall semester, that's really the bogey for us. That's really the compounding has continued. We're hoping that there's a real bounce back in the spring, but across the board, it may mean we netted out a 5% decrease across all of the fiscal year. So that really is the fundamental that we're sort of trying to work from.
that makes sense, Dr. Cook. Okay.
Can I just ask a question on that? When we look at student enrollment and the reduction, is it dropping out or postponing coming back? If we've had a 16 and 22% reduction, and if things are looking better at the end of this spring and you're looking at the fall, wouldn't you see a resurgence in people picking up their degrees again and trying to get back to normal? Or is there any data with that you're looking at to be able to prepare for that?
Yeah, broad-based community colleges are all contending with this same issue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of multifaceted. You would hope that as vaccination is distributed, as employment comes back in different sectors, you also then see families able to kind of get themselves stabilized so that they can then turn their attention back to school. But that's why we've seen the real cliff. And again, we're not all the way back where we can hope that they would be ready to add school back in, because it's both. It's both on the recruitment and the retention side that we have taken those hits this year.
Questions on enrollment or anything? Yep. Okay, so why don't we move on to expenses? So on the expense side, we're expecting full-time staff, the number of FTEs, to be relatively flat at 373. Part-time salaries are reflecting the assumed enrollment decline, so a little bit lower. We have included in this version of the budget salary increases per the union contracts for all the union employees. There's a placeholder here for NUP increases at 1.5%. Again, that's to be discussed. Operational expenses are held relatively flat. And then on the capital side, we've got the usual facilities capital amount at 3.1 million. And then this year we're adding, and we talked about this before, 1.7 million in IT capital per the 5-year IT capital plan. And at the next meeting, Mary will present more detail on that. I also have a little, just a comment. So there's nothing in this budget for Building 20, but that's something, again, as Dr. Cook mentioned, to discuss at some point. Also in this budget is CARISA, the COVID relief funding, this sort of the HERF2, that second round of funding. The total institutional funding is 6.1 million in that round of funding. And we're allocating about 2 million at this point to incremental expenses for things like testing and cleaning and creating online curriculum, things like that. And 4.1 million of the institutional funds is being applied to existing expenses. And that's really, we're using that to help balance our budget. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. This is the detailed version of the budget.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Oh, sure.
Sorry, before you go. So
Yep.
is the IT budget $8 million over 5 years, or and $1.7 million is for 2022?
The budget is 1.7 million for FY22.
Okay, so over a 5-year plan, it's over $8 million.
It's I think a little less than 8. It's not the same amount every year.
Okay.
And we'll present that. We'll present the detail on the 5 years at the next meeting. The good news this year, as we'll see, is that we're able to apply some of this COVID relief funding to the 1.7 million. So probably about 1 million of the 1.7 can be directly funded with the COVID relief funding,
Thank you.
with the CRISA funding. Any other questions on those assumptions? So I'm sure no one can read this. I can't read it on my screen, but this is the detailed budget. If you go to the next slide, it kind of gives us an easier to look at version. So just to orient you, if the first column is the FY21 board approved budget, that was a break-even budget. The next column is the FY22 baseline budget. This is what the budget, this is our first draft of the budget without the COVID funding. And so if you look at the bottom line there, net income loss, it's a deficit of close to $5 million. If you go to the fourth column, that's the proposed budget with the CRISA funding, and applying $4.1 million of the CRISA funding to our budget, to existing expenses, that brings us to about an $800,000 deficit. So our first draft of the budget is about an $800,000 deficit. I'm sure we'll be able to reconcile that to break even by the end of this budgeting process, but just to give you a sense of where we are. And so for me, like when I looked at this, the first thing I said was, well, how did we go from a 21 budget of break even to a 22 budget without the additional funding of $5 million? What's accounting for that swing? And the swing really is in those two lines that are highlighted yellow. So if we go to the next slide, there's some commentary there. So it's really in two places. There are a lot of small moving parts throughout the budget, but the two big chunks of change there are the student fee revenue reduction of about $3.5 million budget to budget. About 2.2 million is in the FY21. So this year's actual being less than the 21 budget. So we started with the 21 budget. We're not meeting that budget this year. We're down, but we're unfavorable to the budget by about 2.3 million this year. And then from that point, we're projecting another decline of about 1.2 million. Again, that's with the 5%. We don't know where we'll end up. So at this point, $3.5 million year over year swing on the revenue side. And then when we take the 1.7 million IT investment that again is necessary for us to sort of keep our, keep the infrastructure updated. When you put those two together, you've got the 5 million. And so those are really the two big swings. There are smaller swings in salaries and other line items, but this is really, the two big buckets where we're seeing that big change. So any questions so far on that?
Yeah, I saw that when I first reviewed this, I was wondering why we weren't comparing to the expected 2021 versus the budget, and I mean, essentially what you're saying is we had a balanced budget. Now we don't have a balanced budget, but when we have that every year, right? That's a par for the course as we go through our budgeting iterations, So really it comes back, I go back to that to the prior slide with all the detail on it, and that's where we can see where we have, student fee revenue is down, the fees are down, right? So I get the view of comparing to what we approved for 2021, but again, that was, as we all know, right, that was a shot in the dark as well, right? We had no basis for anything, and coming up with dollar amounts. Now we have a good, much more solid footing in terms of additional funding we're going to get. So I like the comparing to the CRISA. I like that, but comparing that to where we expect to finish for 2021 as opposed to comparing it to the budget for 2021.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the reason that that's tricky is because going forward, we're isolating the COVID related expenses in particular places, but in the current year financials, the revenue is easily identified, but the expenses are spread throughout a lot of different accounts. And so when you kind of compare line item to line item, there's a lot of COVID related or, CARES Act covered expenses in different line items. It was harder to do the year over year comparison. The other thing is that we're starting to see some of the expenses coming back in. So we had this artificially low expense this year. And the expectation is that if we're closer to, if we have more activity on campus next year, the expenses are going to be closer to the 21 budget versus the 21 actual. At least that's my thinking, is that I don't want us to be too complacent and think that some of the savings that we've experienced this year are going to carry forward. We're kind of going back to where we started. So yeah,
I see it as a variance explanation, right? So compared to 2021 expected, we would say, let's just say, for instance, if we have more on-campus activity as you described, you'd say you expect to spend more, and then you say, oh, and by spending more, we're getting back to the budgeted levels for 2021. That kind of thought process would make sense to me, as opposed to just comparing back to the budget for 2021, because we could see 2022 play out identical to something we literally experienced for the first time with a COVID impact, which is 2021. And basically, you started off the revenue side by saying that you're coming 5% down from a COVID impacted amount in 2021. So I'd expect expenses to take the same track.
Yeah, I think that in a couple slides, I'll talk about what our next steps are, and we'll be taking, a deeper dive into those details. I think as a starting point, wanting to be more conservative in our first draft, it made more sense to kind of take the higher numbers that were in the budget versus the actual. So again, we'll be digging into that, taking a deeper dive into the details in the next month. And so the next time you see it, it'll be a little more refined in terms of the projections.
Andrea, this is Jeff. Could you go back to the previous slide that shows the 26 million or so in full-time salaries? It seems to me, looking at, we have 375 full-time salaried teachers, et cetera. Are we challenging ourselves with a low student to teacher ratio? I mean, you have to keep your teachers, whether you have 10 people in the class or 2 people. Is there a real correlation that you'd have to really look at? If we didn't have that COVID relief funding, I don't know which bill that's coming from, but that's $4.1 million in difference. And I don't see a change in the full-time salary dollar amount. Is there going to be pressure on us to perhaps lay off teachers because we don't have enough student enrollment? I mean, when do you get to that point? Maybe it's too early in the budget to really look at that.
So that's an interesting question. I think the question about the full-time salaries to me is really an interesting longer term question. In the shorter term, the flex comes in the adjunct salaries. So, and I'll let, if any of my colleagues want to jump in and supplement what I'm saying, feel free. But the flex is really in the part-time salaries in the adjunct. So I would actually expect to see, it's possible I wouldn't be surprised to see our projections for part-time salaries be lower than what you're seeing now in the next version of the budget, as we match up the part-time salaries to the to the enrollment. So it's really the part-time faculty that's more sort of flexible in terms of the expense. As we look further out in terms of, multiple years, that's more of a question about what the full-time salaries look like. But we will be scrubbing the, we'll definitely be reviewing all the detail on the full-time salaries as well.
I understand that.
Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
Okay. And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free from my team.
Well, I'm not from the team, but I can talk a little bit about the question about the instructor-student ratios you were asking about. Mm-hmm. Certainly in SHIPS, in the allied health programs, those ratios are driven by the accreditation requirements. So those are fixed, and those costs are fixed. We have more flexibility again in our courses, in our core courses, in our English and math classes, et cetera, courses like such as those that are required. We're able to have larger classes. And then in some of the labs that we offer, particularly in the STEM areas, we have we have capacity issues as to how many students we have. So we're not exactly all over the place because classes are not larger than 32 students. But there are great fluctuations discipline-based and accreditation-based, if that helps a little bit to explain what goes on.
Mhm. Thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions on the things we've covered so far? So if not, we can advance the slides to the next one we haven't seen yet. Let's see. Go one more, please. Okay, so this is really what are we going to do next? So we presented this initial draft. Between now and the next meeting, we will refine the enrollment assumptions. You've asked great questions, and we'll definitely look into that. We'll look into the salary, so look at our full-time vacancy factor, what positions might not be filled throughout the whole year, adjust the adjunct salaries based on enrollment, what we were just speaking of. A big variable here is going to be what the on-campus activity is. That really impacts our operational expenses. So we're going to drill down into the details and really figure out, how we can flex expenses based on our assumptions about what will be going on campus. We'll also take a closer look at the Carissa funding. The new funding coming out, I think, might be substantial, and we'll look to optimize that as well. And as Dr. Cook mentioned, we can have a discussion about whether we need to find some funding for the automotive and cosmetology programs. If you can just go to the next slide. So it seems a little dramatic. It's not really intended to be, but really wanted to point out that, we're very lucky to have this, this COVID relief funding. What we're assuming will be in the 22 budget, and then we think this additional funding will take us to 23. So without that, we'd be having more difficult conversations about, where we can find savings. And so just so you know, this is where my mind is. I'm very happy to have the funding, but I'm really focused on that baseline budget without the additional funding to see, how we can really manage that over the long term. And we're really going to need to prepare together to otherwise, we're going to reach the end of that relief funding bridge at some point, and we need to be prepared for that. So any questions at all or comments?
No question. Just hopefully when we get to the end of that bridge, the revenue will tick up, so we'll back up to where it used to be, so we can kind of help, no pun intended, bridge the gap. So, but I hear you. We need to think about a world where we're back to kind of hard to say, but normal. But I'm with you. Yep. Any other questions, comments for Andrea? Okay, we're going to our fiscal year 22 facilities and capital projects, and then we'll have a discussion on back to our automotive and cosmetology subcommittee discussion.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So I'm going to talk about both the STIC and the DCAM funded facilities capital plans and the FY22 budget outlook. And I'm going to start with the next slide, which I think most, if not all of you, have already seen, that shows the difference between the DCAM involved projects and the STIC projects where DCAM isn't involved at all. The top is any STIC funded projects with a total cost less than $300,000. We have a complete delegation for those, and there are essentially 4 steps in the whole process. The lower half shows the STIC funded projects which are over $300,000 and all DCAM funded projects. So when the project is over $300,000, that's when DCAM needs to get involved and a certified study needs to be done. And so as you can see, there's a lot more steps in projects that involve DCAM than just our STIC funded projects. So we'll move to the next slide.
I thought about timeline when I reviewed this last night. I mean, these are this is a calendar months, but it conceivably could be all that's that needs to happen in the bottom slice.
Right.
It's amazing.
And you talked about the radio station project before, and that's a good example of if it was just our funds and it was under 300, it certainly wouldn't have taken as long as it has. But because now DCAM is involved, we're also involved with the accessibility board and we had to ask for waiver 3 times. And so everything takes a lot longer. Okay, so the STIC FY22 budget is actually broken into 4 different categories. The campus master plan addendum projects, those are all in support of the campus master plan that began essentially with the building 19. And under there's a group of projects that I'll actually highlight a few of them later. So I'm not going to spend time going through them right now. But the second one is the building and land improvements. And these projects are related to mainly deferred maintenance on the campus, which includes the infrastructure and the grounds. So like you'll see in the second line, the paving behind building 27, which also would include upgrades to the sewer. And then the third line is deferred maintenance, emergencies, and life and safety. Deferred maintenance pretty much says, I mean, I think you've heard more about deferred maintenance than you ever wanted to. But it covers, the annual repairs to sidewalks, masonry, gutters. That also includes minor emergencies like HVAC equipment failures, small floods. And then the last one is life safety, which includes accessibility projects, sprinklers, anything related to fire equipment, those kinds of things. And then the last category is energy savings and classroom and common area upgrades. And this also includes some annual ongoing things and others that are just a year at a time. The energy savings include things like the EV chargers that we installed this year and the replacement of the old light bulbs in the classrooms with LEDs. This category also includes signage, replacement of window shades as they break, and then upgrades to classrooms, which could include things like painting, furniture, lighting upgrades. And then the last is the common area space. And those are, a good example of that is the Wi-Fi study lounges that we implemented in each of the classroom buildings. But it also includes cafes and lobbies and, any stairwells, anything that's a common area that we need to keep up. And that brings, go ahead.
Sorry, in terms of the list here, there's really then only 2 projects that are of a size that would require that added level of due diligence. Is that correct? The workforce classrooms and the police relocation? Because everything else is under 300,000.
Correct, except that some of these projects are carryovers from this year. So they started this year and they'll be finished at the beginning of next year. So they, in total over FY21 and FY22, they're over 300,000, like robotics and electronics. That one began this year, so that one required a certified study.
So I think that would be important to see, because that's hard for us to tell that these are multi-year projects that are much larger in scale than what's being presented here. So I think it would be important to talk about maybe the budget for the whole project, and then how it's going to get funded year over year is important as well. But again, when we look at this, I would have assumed there were only 2 projects that needed to go through the DCAM due diligence.
Right.
But if there are more, I think that there should be a better way to show those larger projects.
Okay, let me move to the next slide, because I think that's a good point. And I actually have highlighted a couple of those projects. The first one being robotics and electronics. So there's a carryover of 450,000 from FY21, although in FY22 we have 50,000. And this is a good example of one of the projects where we will start it in the summer and carry it over into July and August, which is FY22. The total project cost is actually 500,000. And the we're currently on target for completing it in late September, pending approval of all of the DCAM approvals that we need to get. The key thing for this particular project is that they are currently in building 20. So this is supporting vacating building 20 by moving them to building 17. Then the next one is lead on the green. Currently, we have no money allocated to this project in FY22, although we do have $350,000 in FY21 that we are carrying over. It became more complicated. We had a certified study done, and when it was reviewed with DCAM, they requested that we do some additional testing 2 separate times. So the original total project cost was estimated at $750,000, but we're waiting for the revised certified study to determine now what that actual number's supposed to be. And as part of this, we're also researching some other funding sources with DCAM and National Park Services.
And I think this came up at the last meeting and Eric talked about it. I know he's not here tonight, but typically, and I'm sure it's probably different because it's property that's owned by the state, but in the federal government, but normally if this was a commercial property, the original owner would be responsible for doing this work. Therefore, it would be the federal government's responsibility to pay for the costs of the remediation, not the college. I mean, the lead got there not by the use of stick, but by the prior use of the facility. So I guess it would be interesting to find out who's really responsible for paying for the remediation. I don't really understand how it could be stick.
Yeah, it's a real thicket that we are trying to navigate through. Some of it is what's the impetus that forces that conversation, right? This is why people utilize legal counsel and lawsuits to help sort of force the conversation. Obviously, that would be a little discomforting for some of our partnerships. We're hoping that the national park, similarly as a recipient of American Rescue Plan funds, would see the benefit of moving this forward. Because what we don't want is for the green, especially with this latest round of testing that identified arsenic, for the green to sort of be unavailable for some further period of time, especially under post-pandemic circumstances when people are back on campus. So we are absolutely trying to sort of push on federal support for getting that mitigated.
Yes. Any other questions on either of those two?
Dr. Cook, has there been any conversation with Rich and Neil regarding possible federal funding? I mean, it is part of national park.
Yes, the challenge is, as the congressman is keen to point out, is there is no more earmarking right now. So he wasn't able to reach in, for example, on behalf of the college and put funding in there in this latest package. Going forward, there will be the ability to earmark. And as he noted in a conversation with us, Western Massachusetts Community College presidents just last week, that it'll be a public process with earmarks now. So we can make a case. What I'm hoping is that we can really focus more on infrastructure or something like that, and that it's really the national park as our partner that can help do this mitigation in particular. And I've worked with his own staff to already communicate.
Okay, so moving on to campus police. The total project cost estimate originally was 1.7 million. We're moving the campus police from building 9, which is one of the small houses, over to building 15. The FY22 number that we have allocated is 800,000. That was a number that was put in when we did the 5-year plan, and it has remained. The certified study, when it was complete, came in with a total project cost that was much higher than the 1.7 million. And so we're currently in the process of working with campus police, the architect, the house doctor, IT, and a couple other people to value engineer the project to see how well we can reduce that total cost. And it's really critical that we continue to move forward with this because it will enhance the safety and accessibility for the police station, and it will improve compliance and accreditation. So it's a really important project for us.
At what dollar level, though, do we not do the project? I mean, I understand it would be great to do it, but $1.7 million seemed high to begin with. And I think the number that got tossed around, I think at the last meeting, was well above that number. And at some point it just becomes impossible to bear that kind of expense versus the reward. So where is that break? And are there other options? Is where we're proposing to put it the only solution? Can we fix the location they're in? It just seems like a lot of money. And at what point does that project not go forward? And if you're still studying it, how do we spend $800,000, you know, plan to spend $800,000 next year without really knowing any of that information?
Boy, there's a lot of questions there. So we have looked at a couple different options for locations for the campus police. And ultimately this was made the most sense and was supposed to be the least expensive location. The value engineering will help us to determine whether or not we can get that cost down low enough. One of the big problems that we have is that no matter where we put them, we have all of the deferred maintenance. So in that number that you heard the last time, like 1.5 million of that number was just deferred maintenance in that building. So that's the infrastructure, that's the electrical, that's HVAC, everything that is part of the deferred maintenance for DCAM. And as part of the work that we do and the projects, we're committed to taking care of that deferred maintenance as we do the project. So did that answer? I think your first question was at what number do we not do it? And I don't think we have that answer yet.
I'd like to ask a question regarding that too. Obviously, Vicky's made a good point. I mean, at some point, you know, $800 per square foot cost is ridiculous. But I guess the question is, of the budget, how much can we rely on DCAM to be able to support us with that, and how much really comes out of our budget?
Yeah, let me try to help Deb sort of navigate this a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, these are, in some ways, the essential stick questions. Is anytime we touch facilities, the price tag is shocking. And as Deb mentioned, when you have buildings that need electrical help, HVAC help, before you can even get in there, this is why our costs are just so astronomical. It's a real Achilles. The hard thing about this is one of those gotta have services on campus. And so there may be actually a life cycle cost on where they can even stay because it was only intended to be temporary to begin with, right, in that current building. So we might be between a rock and a hard place. I think what we have is our work to put a proposal in front of you that is our sort of best attempt to make this happen. It may be clearly much more expensive than any of us wish to, but we only have so much money. Essentially, DCAM, in the way that the Commonwealth now allocates, says this is all you have, right? It's that 12.1 over 5 years. Do what you may with it, which is a drop in the bucket given our facilities cost. And we know we have about that 3.1 million as our earmark every year for facilities. That's the bundle. It typically is not much larger, except when we have federal help. And obviously we got to work through the priorities in the master plan when we have that kind of federal assistance. So this is a tough one. Obviously we're going to need to move some things around and come back with a sort of formalized piece. But what I would say is the commonality here is DCAM requires certified studies. When we move forward on that, we all of a sudden come back and the costs have just escalated. That's really something that's painful for us because it's out of our control. And so as Deb said, we will value engineer it back and try to cut that down. But there's that escalator on every one of these projects that we end up contending with.
Yeah.
Deb, and I don't know if this makes any sense, but is one of the options to take down the house and rebuild from scratch so that we're not trying to, you know, fix and update an old building where we're going to put $1.5 million into something that's old and needs to be upgraded versus probably building something totally new from scratch that would be cheaper?
That would be on my list. Unfortunately, National Park Service, because it's historical building and it's the highest historical priority, they wouldn't let us take that building down. Yeah. Yep. All right, moving on. So the last project I am highlighting here is the ship's move from building 20. We had a cost estimate of $36.3 million. There is a certified study required. Right now, we're waiting for to hear back from DCAM on funding. But the next step in the process would be to have a certified study done. And we have discussed the possibility of starting that certified study ourselves in order to keep this project moving forward. But there is a cost associated with it. Funding and timing are still up in the air until we hear back from DCAM.
When do we expect to hear back from DCAM? Is there any time frame?
Yeah, May, June is what we've heard from them, that they will provide across the board, UMass, state universities, and community colleges, their awards of major capital funding. And that's what they've shared with us.
And how does us spending money to keep this thing moving make sense? I'm trying to understand that. Like if we're waiting to hear back from them, how would us spending money over the next couple of months do anything towards keeping this moving? It's a big price tag.
Well, the time frame of the certified study and getting that approved is a significant amount of time. So if we could continue moving that piece forward, then when we hear back from DCAM with the funding approval, we won't be starting from doing the certified study. That'll already be completed or partially completed.
Got it. Makes sense. But if we get bad news,
skip one of their steps.
Right. If we get bad news from DCAM though, right. And this is money already spent and we already got a tight budget.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
How much would the study cost about?
I think on that one, we were talking about 250 or 300,000. It's a big project. So
that's a big spend without knowing for sure what our next steps are.
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't see how we
300,000, if we can't move forward on that, could make a huge difference in other projects. And
exactly.
If we don't get funding, there is no project. We have no ability to get money from anywhere else at the moment to move something of this scope forward. So I'm not sure. I mean, I know it would be nice from a timing perspective, but you know, we could sunk $250,000 into a study and find out that the state, you know, doesn't allocate sufficient funds and we're not doing anything with that study.
Yeah, the hope with this one is that truly by the final budget that you all approve, that we have the clarity from DCAM on this project, on building 20, so that we can round out then what your appetite is as far as a contribution. How do you finish the funding stack? This was very similar to building 19 when the trustees approved $3 million out of reserves to get essentially the $50 million to move that forward. I'm not sure that the certified study work predates me here, but that great point. It would be really painful to sort of push money against something that would be delayed. What I would say is there's such an imperative given the condition of that building, we're going to have to do it eventually. Now that certified study certainly has a life, it's only good for so long. So we know, and I don't know, Deb, if they typically put a timetable on that.
Yeah, it's 2 years. And actually I was going to talk about that when I review the DCAM 5-year plan in the next slide.
Okay.
So what I guess I'm worried about two things. One is if you see the wisdom in helping prime the pump, because being good for 2 years gives us a chance to really continue to make the case why it's such an imperative and that it's money well spent. Because as you see with the certified study process, it takes forever. The other part is I'm actually worried that 250 is low. What we see with other projects that carry this price tag, that the certified studies are sometimes double that. I think that for Westfield, didn't we see Parenzo was more like 450,000?
Yes.
So I'm worried that that's a low amount actually for the certified study. So again, I don't want you to have sticker shock if down the road we come to you and say we need $500,000 in enabling.
That conversation's a whole lot easier if we know that the state's provided sufficient funding that we can meet the gap. But if in fact they provide, and I think if I remember the numbers, we're expecting them hopefully to come up with about 25 million.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we're anywhere near there. If they come up with 10 or 15, it doesn't really matter. We don't have the ability to fill the gap. I mean,
yeah, the tea leaves are essentially we'll get to 25 or we'll get 0 is really what they've sort of alluded to.
So how do we spend 400,000? You know, let's go to the casino because those would be the same odds. We don't know. Why would we spend $400,000 on something that's either yes or no? And we have no knowledge at this point where that's going to land in a very tight budget year. I mean, it would be great if we get it, but if we don't, we've plunked $400,000 into a study that really has no value because it won't matter that it's good for 2 years.
The good thing about the study is that even though it's only good for 2 years, it has to be redone, but not completely redone because the basics of the study are there. So you're not paying to have it redone completely. You're just paying to have it updated. But one of the things that we can look at is get a realistic cost on what that certified study would be.
Hey, given our tight budget, I mean, we've got challenges all across the board that we've been talking about all meeting. And when we're going to know more definitively in May, June, we're talking about a couple of months out, right? It makes it. I don't see how we spend 300, 400, pick a number, $500,000 on something, and again, could be a complete throwaway. It just in terms of priority, given we could get 0 from DCAM, it just doesn't. It's hard for me to understand why we would take that approach. So why don't we certainly, I think it makes sense to kind of cost out what that would be, but we spent a lot of time talking about this. Now I know you want to go through one more slide, and we still need to get through the topic. We can certainly circle back on this before any money is spent, because it just is hard for us to understand how that approach makes the most use out of the tight budget dollars.
Right. Okay, so next slide. So the next slide is the DCAM 5-year plan for fiscal years FY19 to FY23. We are currently in the 3rd year of the 5-year plan. As you can see, the money that was spent in FY19 and FY20 and FY21, for the most part, was spent on certified studies, with a few exceptions. This year, we actually began implementing some of the work that was identified in the completed certified studies. So we've spent about $5 million to date of that $12.1 million.
In certified studies?
No, there has been some work that has been done, but the majority of it was certified studies.
Oh my God.
Yep.
Okay.
And I'll explain a little bit when I go down to the 3 little bullets down there. The reason why we actually started implementing some of the projects from the certified study is that we didn't want to continue to have certified studies done, knowing that we don't have enough money to cover the work that needs to be done from those certified studies. So you'll see in this slide that there's 4 different categories. One is the projects that have been completed in FY19 and FY20. And some of that was projects that had actually been started, so that ended up being paid for with DCAM funding. The second one is projects in process with certified studies that have been completed. So we started some in FY20 and again in FY21. Some of that is projects in process. Then the third category is projects in process but have no, the certified study itself is in process. It's not the actual project itself. And then the last one is the category of certified studies not started. So that has 2 projects that we have not started the studies. So you can see, if you look in that last column, it has the certified study total project. I'm going to skip over the labs for a second and go to the campus-wide envelope study and the building 32 roof. The campus-wide envelope study was a certified study that was done, that was a review of all of the exterior of all of the buildings on campus. So it included masonry, windows, doors, and roofs for every building on campus. And the total estimate for that one alone is $31 million. And you can see that in the 44 million in that last column includes 31 million just for the campus-wide envelope study work that needs to be done. So as part of that study, knowing that we don't have enough money to do the 31 million, all of that work, we did pull a piece out and start to do some of that work that was identified in that study. And that's the building 32 roof, which is going to happen this summer. The other one that I have on there is building 2 and 17 ADA labs. And I included that one because that is the only one on the DCAM 5-year plan that actually has a direct impact on the students. They're taking one of each type of lab and making it accessible and bringing it up to code. So that's a direct impact on the students. And that one is in process right now. And I believe the completion date is end of September, beginning of October. And then the last one again is our favorite project, Ships Move to Building 20. And we don't have funding for that one yet. It's not in the, it's not in the STIC capital and it's not in the DCAM 5-year capital. So we talked a little bit about that already. And that is the end of my presentation. Does anybody have any other questions?
So I guess maybe I'm confused. I apologize. These are monies associated with work that was done after certified studies were completed. These aren't the costs of the certified studies.
It's actually a combination of both. Some of it is a cost for the certified studies and some of it is cost for the actual work that was done.
So can we, since you've highlighted 3, can we just use one as an example? So the building 217 ADA labs, what was the cost of the study and what was the estimate of the work?
So I would have to look that up. I don't know that off the top of my head. Let me see if I can find it quick.
That's okay. I'm just trying to get a sense for what are we spending on certified studies?
Right.
And what are we spending on actual construction related work?
Right. So for instance, the building 32 roof, out of that 31 million is $704,000 for just the building 32 roof. And I believe the study was somewhere in the 100 to 200 range. What? So the study is a small portion of the actual construction costs.
So that's the one that generated a $44 million budget?
It's actually 31 million of that 44, yes.
And that costs 100,000. That study costs 100,000, or just the roof portion of that study?
No, the whole study.
Okay, so $31 million worth of expected construction costs. To identify those, we paid about 100,000, but we think maybe moving to building 20 across the street that could be a $37 million project, we think is going to be a $500,000 study or a $400,000 study. How do we determine the cost of the study? They don't seem to make sense to me.
Well, we don't actually, the house doctors do. What happens is when we have a project that we want to do, we contact one of the house doctors and they write us a proposal. They review what needs to be done as part of the certified study, and then they'll give us a proposal to do that certified study. that has to then be sent to DCAM and approved by DCAM before they can actually start the certified study. So that's where that number comes from.
Okay.
Do you just want to describe what the definition of a house doctor is?
Oh, I'm sorry. So a house doctor is either an architect or an engineer that has been assigned to, by the state to STIC. They're allocated a certain amount of money. I think this year it was $750,000 that we have to spend with each one of those. And we pick and choose depending on what type of project it is. And there's a good variety of architects and engineers with different backgrounds. So if we're working on a historical project, we'll look for an architect that has more historical background.
So does that 750 come out of our 12 million one? That the cost associated with the house doctor of 750,000?
No, that's state funded. Well, yes, it comes out of the 12 million or the 3.1 million. So if I have to do a certified study for a STIC capital project, that would come out of the STIC 3.1.
And is that
Makes sense.
750 an annual over the 5 years?
I'm sorry, say that again.
So is $750,000 allocated annually for the house doctor over 5 years? So would that be a $4.5 million potential expense of the 12.1?
It's not allocated based on length of time. It's just allocated on how quickly we use that funding. So, and when we find that we're reaching the end of those funds for some of the house doctors, then we have to reapply and request that they appoint additional house doctors to us. And that 750 just went up from, it used to be 500,000 and last year it went up to 750.
So maybe I'm not asking my question well, or I'm not understanding, but you said 750,000 was allocated for house doctors for this year.
Oh, okay. So so the state allows us to pay those house doctors up to 750,000 for as long as we need them till we get to that 750,000. So that money isn't allocated, that, you know, that whole 750,000 for each house doctor isn't allocated anywhere in these budgets. It is used as we do each project. So for instance, if I have 3 projects this year and I have a house doctor that has 300,000 left in their allocation, then I will look at whether or not those 3 certified studies for that project can be done within that allocation. And if not, then I'll hire 2 different house doctors. Does that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, I guess it's clear as mud. Is it 750 a year or is it 750 over the 5 years of the
No,
DCAM?
it doesn't have, it's not based on a year. It's based on how long it takes you to spend that money.
So can I just jump in for a minute? Because just being new to this myself, the way I think of it, it's almost like a blanket purchase order for a particular vendor. So there are multiple different vendors that could be house doctors. So we might, it's like having it's as if we have a blanket purchase order with multiple different, you know, architects or engineers or whatever. And then based on the project, we choose which one's appropriate and we can spend up to that 750, you know, until we run out, and then we have to renew the purchase order.
So
that makes sense?
But is it part of the 5-year allocation? Is it 750,000 in this open purchase order over 5 years, or is it annually?
How is it funded?
Let me try it. If you put our 3.1 million in with the DCAM money over that same 5-year period, it's like, I was going to use the equivalent of like a retainer for a lawyer. Because of the public procurement process, it allows us to access that architectural firm. But the funding for that may come from the college or it may come from the DCAM funds. What it does is once we get past that 750, we sort of are at the mercy then of the state to sort of move things around again. Is that fair to say, Deb?
But is that 750 5 years or annual?
Neither. So when we do a project cost estimate, that design fee or house doctor fee is part of that project cost. So it does get paid out of one of the buckets of money, but it's not specifically allocated.
So until you consume it, you've got it.
Right.
Essentially. So it could be
Correct.
over 5 years, could be over 2 years.
10 years.
It could be right. Okay.
But we usually spend it in less than 5.
And that's based on how many studies you think you need based on the needs of the college's infrastructure, correct?
Right. And the house doctors don't just do the certified studies. They do the certified studies and then they do the construction drawings to put out to bid, and then they monitor the construction.
So have we done like for an example, have we done a certified study for the police station or other projects that have been completed? We're on a timeline.
The certified study has been completed for the campus police, but because the numbers came in so high, we have not yet submitted it to DCAM. We want to do the value engineering before we submit it.
To that, the two we wanted to actually try to get to, and I realize where we are with time, was this is the backdrop for the conversation about automotive and cosmetology, because we have not done the certified studies for those two, not only because of the costs for the studies themselves, but also there's a degree of unknown for what the costs will say the projects will now cost us.
So maybe we should just jump into that, Mac, if you're okay with that. I don't think the ad hoc committee intended that we were anywhere near a certified study. I think the rationale behind the committee's decision to move forward with reinstatement of the other 5 is that the dollar amounts that were presented for the reinstatement was for those programs was relatively small and understandable in scope, and therefore recommending and voting to Ways and Means to reinstate those programs seemed like it was manageable and explainable. The numbers that were presented to the ad hoc committee around automotive and cosmetology were numbers that had never been discussed in scope and size, and therefore not understanding how automotive, I think the number off the top of my head was $7 million. There was no way we were in a position to recommend reinstating that program without understanding that, but it's not the 7 million, it's how did we even get to 7 million to reinstate that program? So I think the next step for that would be through Ways and Means rather than a reiteration of the ad hoc committee, but through Ways and Means looking at some sort of an independent review, not a certified study, but an independent review of those programs, program related costs, and what was presented as the costs associated with reinstating those programs. And then assessing whether or not we can move forward with them. And then that would be a certified study, I guess, if there was a desire to do that by Ways and Means to recommend that to the board. But how we got to 7 on automotive, and I think maybe 3, if my memory serves me, on cosmetology, were just big surprises. And so trying to understand that.
And we're most certainly ready to move forward with that. So again, against the sort of public procurement obligations, in this current year's budget, with that surplus that we're running, is a sort of placeholder for $100,000, $50,000 each, to potentially bring in that kind of consultant through an RFQ, or even using the house doctor to actually help get you that clarity, or at least a view on these facilities costs. If you so desire, we can move that forward.
Yeah, I guess it's even more basic than facilities. I think the whole question is, how did that facilities number come into the programs at such a high level? And do we really need that facilities component to actually reinstate automotive or cosmetology? I mean, yes, would it be nice to come back and put the program in, with state-of-the-art equipment and a new location? And I don't even know how those numbers came together. So I might be talking about things that are, not how the numbers came together, but how did those numbers even come together? So I think it's more of a financial review of the the program costs. It's not a facilities thing. It's probably something that either the accountants can do, help do, or there is, I think, a third party firm that helps community colleges review program related expenses to determine bringing on a new program, shuttering a program, reinstating a program. It becomes a financial question. It's really not a facilities question at this point, because I don't want to speak for the group, but it's really a $7 million cost for automotive. I think I probably know what the answer is, but how did it get to 7 is really more the question, not somebody who can justify the 7 facilities component, but why do we need $7 million to reinstate automotive when it clearly wasn't running at that level of a budget before? And how did we get to 3 million on cosmetology? So I think through Ways and Means, it would make sense to try to, maybe visit with the accountants to see if they're in a position to assist with that independent review. And if they're not, then perhaps reach out to this other group and see how they can assist and what the cost would be. And then we would bring it back through Ways and Means to request that funding. But it's really, it's not a facilities review.
Yeah, Vicki, I think it was pretty clear coming out of our ad hoc committee that we wanted a completely independent review.
Right.
So I think what you're saying here is that, we just need to identify, who can actually do that, and then come back to Ways and Means for funding, for the independent review as the next step. So I think that was a good update in terms of where we're at, and so this has not fallen by the wayside in terms of kind of what our next steps are. It really is to get a completely independent review of what it would cost us to bring the programs back in some way, shape, or form. And again, the cost of that needs to be approved by the Ways and Means to continue to move forward with paying that independent firm to conduct the study.
So let me just check on clarity. So we certainly hear you. There are entities like Gray and Associates that community colleges have certainly brought in to help do that, essentially look at program viability. There's money in the current fiscal year that is already there that you sort of looked at, that we can move that forward. So we're hearing that, I think, essentially, Mac, that you want us to move that forward, procure that administratively. That's the only lever that we have, right? Procure an entity like that to come in and start doing that work. We can start moving on that tomorrow.
Yeah, I think we need to, coming out of our ad hoc committee, who's driving that, right? So I think we need to, I think the committee needs to have the conversation, to kind of get that ball rolling. Because when it's independent, we need to work through kind of how that's going to look. And I don't want you guys to take the burden of, based on our conversations ad hoc committee, I don't want you guys to take the burden of connecting with the firm and getting them here and all that. I think that's something that the ad hoc committee is going to do, but we need to work through those details.
We can certainly talk offline, Mac. There isn't an avenue where the trustees themselves can hire that way. We'd have to certainly we can bring in legal counsel to sort of, manage on that. But I wouldn't know how to do that.
Okay, and we can certainly talk to Ken. I'd done that before, and actually Ken was talking about the independent firm that was recommended, and actually Ken was the one who suggested, reaching out to the accounting firm to see if they could do that. And I'm happy to revisit that issue with him to see how that process would work.
Okay.
Great, appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Vicki. Thank you, Dr. Cook. There's no old business, any new business? Excellent. Okay. Well, we know we've gone over time here, 6:30. Appreciate everyone for being active and hanging in there. And with that, why don't we have a roll to adjourn the meeting?
So moved.
Yes. Mary Kate Murin,
Yes.
Max Starks,
Yes.
Vicki Krause,
Yes.
Eric Hagopian, Maurice Lindsay,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler,
Yes.
and Janae McDonald.
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Renee. Thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.